Welcome to this next episode of the Decarb Connect podcast, and I'm really very pleased to welcome Ravi Gurumurthy, who's the Chief Executive of Nesta, to join me today. And this year, they have published their 10-year strategy, which looks at how to leverage mission-led innovation to improve the lives of millions across the UK. And one key component of that is looking at the impact of climate on society and looking for ways in which they can influence good best practice moving forward. So Ravi, you have had a really interesting career spanning both government roles. You were involved as a leader in the International Rescue Committee and their innovation lab there. And now you're at Nesta. So why don't you just sort of fill in the gaps in that introduction and give a bit of a sense about how you've arrived at this moment in time?
Thank you, Alex, and thank you for having me on. So this is my third time in my career where I'm starting to focus on climate change. And I was just reflecting before this podcast on how things have changed, because I first started working on this back in 2006 when I was an advisor to David Miliband. And we suddenly had this really unique moment where the parties, Conservative and Labour, were fighting for the Green vote. You had the Stern report about to come out and Al Gore publishing his movie, and there suddenly felt to be a lot of momentum. And at that point, we took quite a lot of advantage and got the Climate Change Act in place. And I was really quite heavily involved in trying to rush that through. And one reflection actually is about the change in ambition between then and now, because at the time we had an ambition which was about a reduction in emissions by 60%. And then during the course of that bill being progressed through Parliament, it went up to 80%, and now we're at net zero. And we've had a lot of ratcheting up of commitments and ambition, perhaps not quite as much progress in terms of actual policies, but we're in a very different place, I think, than 15 years ago.
Yeah, definitely. I know we are sort of looking at some similar issues, but from different lenses. It feels like there has been another kind of big push towards real activity around decarbonisation. And yes, that's partly about policy, but interestingly, I think more and more happening that isn't so dependent, or isn't only dependent on that as a lever.
I mean, when I worked on climate change the last time, it was actually from 2010 to 2013, and I was in charge of the UK government's programme to try and meet the climate change targets that we had, and trying to set new targets like carbon budget 4. And at that time, you'll remember, post-financial crash, energy prices were spiking, and David Cameron had gone from wanting to be the greenest government ever to saying, let's get rid of all this green crap, as he put it. And it was really interesting how at the time it really felt like the green agenda was under siege. The government didn't really want to be doing the kind of bold things that were necessary. Whereas you think now, again, it feels like there's a lot of momentum, a lot of cross-party consensus, and particularly off the back of big progress actually in the electricity sector and in batteries and in cars. The debate feels different, and it also feels broader. You feel like there's momentum in industry and amongst citizens as well.
I know when your team and I were talking about involving you on a podcast, that their point was, well, Ravi's going to tell you about the concerns for the UK simply not being on track for net zero. What's our starting premise for this discussion?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is actually we've done pretty well. So we are 40% down on 1990 emissions. And I think no country in the G20 has seen such a big reduction in emissions. And we've also seen pretty dramatic progress in the last decade on things like renewable electricity and batteries and EVs. When I was in the Energy and Climate Change Department 10 years ago, I would not have expected such progress, particularly on renewable energy, but also actually on EVs. So yes, we've seen some substantial progress, but when you look at what we really need to be doing, given the increased ambition that we've got of net zero, it really isn't anywhere near enough. And in particular, while we've seen a lot of progress in those two sectors which have got momentum, electric cars and renewable electricity, all the difficult areas that were stuck a decade ago are still pretty stuck. And I feel like we've almost had a bit of a lost decade when it comes to renewable heat or carbon capture and storage or agriculture and aviation demand. None of those issues are really being grasped. Even where you've got ambitious commitments, for instance, on heat pumps, there are big figures touted, I think, 600,000 heat pumps to be rolled out every year in 2028, but only about 30,000 currently. There's no real sense of a plan or program to get from where we are now to where we want to be. And then in other areas, I think we've just not even got the level of ambition required, for instance, on hydrogen production or district heat networks. So yeah, I think we've had a lot of progress, but the next leg of the journey is much, much harder. It involves a lot more consumer change in terms of what we drive and how we heat our homes and how we use electricity. And I just worry we've not prepared the ground in the last decade to really start accelerating in the 2020s.
Okay, so there has been progress, there has been some progress, and there has been some progress towards decarbonisation of home heating. What is the story around domestic heating, and what proportion of CO2 comes from that source, and what really needs to be happening to start getting ahead of climate change?
So 17% of our emissions come from heating buildings. That's space heating in buildings. There's probably another 2% or so from hot water in those buildings. So, roughly 20% of UK emissions from this area. And what I think is difficult, particularly for the UK compared to others, is that we actually have quite a good system in place already. So the fact that we have this gas grid means that we've enjoyed pretty cheap, effective heating for many years. And I think it makes it harder for us to sort of leap to a heat pump type future that other countries like Finland or Germany already are, because they don't have the effectiveness and efficiency of the gas grid already in place.
What is it that you think needs to happen?
So first, there are a whole set of technologies that we need to adopt in homes. And one of the things I think we've failed to address in the last 10 years is more clarity about what technologies will work for what household types. And we've not really had the technology race that one would have hoped in the last decade. And there are still big open questions about the degree to which we're going to need air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps versus, for instance, district heating and heat networks, or even some role for hydrogen in that future as well. So I think there are debates about that future. And it's sometimes quite hard to resolve, because it's not as though you could just have a free-for-all and allow whatever technology to run, because there are big consequences. If you start going for electrification of heat, then you have to gear up the grid and the electricity capacity to cope with that. If you want to sort of start injecting hydrogen into the pipes, that's a huge decision, which would mean retaining our gas infrastructure for a lot longer. So you can't really allow for a total free-for-all. And I think we are going to have to try and make some slightly bigger decisions quicker about the balance between those different technologies. I'd also just flag up that, as well as the big one-off decisions to switch out our boilers for some other technology, there are also big ongoing behaviors that we need to shift. So one, I think we need to be much smarter about how we heat our homes. So for instance, room by room heating controls can have a huge impact. If you look at the impact that insulation would make versus just lowering the average temperature in our homes by having smart room by room thermostats, actually it's the latter that can make a bigger difference, even if the former is needed to actually make heat pumps more effective, and make our homes more thermally efficient. So that's one aspect of behavior change facilitated by technology. I think the other big side of this is thinking about how we can shift demand for electricity. So if we electrify our heating and transport, we may need 2 or 3 times the electricity capacity we have currently. And that is going to be substantially affected by whether we heat our homes and charge our cars at the right moment. And if we don't get that right, we'll actually have to strengthen our grid and increase our electricity capacity substantially. If we do get it right and smooth that peak load, we can do this transition in a much more cheap, effective way. And I think one question that is open is the extent to which we're going to rely purely on automation, on smart controls that optimize when you charge your car and switch your dishwasher on, versus whether we as individuals can behave and do that ourselves without the automation being in place.
I guess the challenge is we tend to view it as a service that someone else manages. It comes magically into the home. We don't really think about it that much. So I suppose part of the behavior change is also, how do we get a bit more proactive about something that's so fundamental to our own little worlds. I guess the second thought I have while you're talking is, when we talk about things like heat pumps and all those other new technologies, I know that there are pockets of the community where these are big discussions all the time, but there's swathes of the UK and swathes of global or Western countries, where these are just not things that people think about. How do you get populations, communities, individuals to actually engage with the issue and not only make it a government-led issue, but for it to be a community-led issue as well?
Yeah, no, exactly. I think if you ask people about gas central heating, I think most people actually don't realize that this is a contributor to climate change and there are CO2 emissions at the end of this. Awareness of technologies like heat pumps are incredibly low. So there's a big journey to go on. I don't necessarily subscribe to the idea that you have to make people super conscious of the climate change effects of these technologies, because I don't think that's the route to actually getting the widespread adoption. I think we have to make these technologies cheap and beneficial to consumers and just attractive, rather than having to convince people it's the green thing and therefore let's do the green thing.
And low friction to actually get into your property.
Exactly, and you sort of mentioned this tension between big government regulation and doing it through that versus making this popular and attractive to consumers. And I think we'll need both. But the crucial thing is that it's very, very difficult to regulate very firmly against the grain of consumer demand. So right now, I think it's possible for the government to have this commitment by 2030 to phase out the sale of petrol and diesel cars, because over the last 10 years, attitudes towards electric cars have totally changed. You have your Jeremy Clarksons, etc., thinking this is a cool, fast, exciting consumer proposition. We're not anywhere near that for heat pumps. And so while you can possibly signal a phase out now, I think you would get a consumer backlash unless we can get some momentum, we can get some early adopters shifting the perception of these technologies.
Let's come around to the other part of this, which is industry itself, so utilities and other service providers and their role in it, the specifics of how they need to respond.
Well, first of all, because you've had some quite bad policies in the last 10 years, with lots of stop-start, like the Green Homes Grant, problems with the renewable heat incentive, the failure of the Green Deal, you've got a real lack of confidence amongst the supply chain. You'd have to have a very strong risk appetite right now to bet your whole business model on low carbon heat. And that is a substantial problem, obviously. If we're going to try and get to hundreds of thousands of heat pumps being rolled out, the supply chain's got to mobilize really heavily. And that's why I actually think that this combination of government regulation and building early momentum is really, really important. But when it comes to the actual role of, say, energy companies and other industries, it's worth just thinking about whether a service or subscription model for heating and electricity can start to become viable and attractive and possibly necessary. And just think about it from the consumer perspective. If you're asking consumers to invest maybe £10,000 in a heat pump and maybe require them to change their radiators or change other aspects of their home, that's a massive ask. It's a big upfront cost. It's a big source of anxiety and risk if you're installing something novel. And the sheer hassle factor is going to be huge. So I think the potential for an intermediary to come in and say, we'll take away the upfront cost, we'll manage this end-to-end process for you, and crucially, we'll almost optimize the use of this heat and electricity over time and help you manage demand, could be a very, very attractive proposition rather than you having to do that yourself. So I think a lot of companies have been talking about energy as a service rather than a product for years. It may now well be the time where those business models come into play. And I think it will particularly come into play around time of use of electricity. So if government starts to put in more aggressive incentives and Ofgem shifts their tariff structure so that you do get rewarded as a consumer for when you use electricity, I think that the role of intermediaries in shifting demand could become quite attractive.
It's interesting how that business model is reflected in some of the discussions in the industrial sphere as well. This kind of idea of carbon capture as service or energy efficiency as service or so forth. It's the same deal, isn't it? It's the challenge of the big upfront cost and the risk that implies, whether you're a consumer or whether you're industry.
Already in the commercial sector for buildings, you have intermediaries come in and basically manage things on consumers' behalf. You don't tend to have that in residential housing. But I think there will be people getting into the market. There is an interesting question of trust, however. So do you trust your energy company who you think makes more money out of you, the more energy you consume, to come and sort of flip their business model and be actually helping you save. It seems very counterintuitive. And that's where I think there is an interesting race between the incumbents, those who you've got an existing relationship with, but who you may not trust to actually save you energy, and the role of entirely new intermediaries coming in and disrupting the market.
Okay, and then so coming back to Nesta then, so what is the role that you see you playing, the wider team as a whole? How do you fit into this discussion, and what needs to happen?
So one of the reasons why we started to get interested in doing work on climate change was the fact that we think the next decade is about consumers. It's really about shifting consumer preferences and behavior around energy. So that the electric home that people will have, where they charge their car and use their heat pump and shift their times of use, is quite a different consumer expectation than we currently have. And what Nesta is building in terms of our capabilities in design, behavioral science, and data science. And while we are not the people to sort of bring the engineering expertise or shift government's regulation and tax, what we can do is hope to build the momentum around early adoption. So let's imagine we do get some strong signals and subsidies and regulation from government. How do we get some lift off by designing ways of shifting consumer behavior, using data to target early adopters, and redesign the business models that could drive change? And so there are three ways in which we're trying to work to try and address this. One, being an innovation partner. So we are looking to partner with energy companies, other companies, to try out ways of shifting behavior and getting people interested in low carbon heat. So that's one role we see for ourselves. And in particular, we'd like to develop rigorous evidence around what works in that respect. So let's not just conduct trials, but conduct trials that have randomized control, randomization, so you can actually prove out what works, and therefore make the case to governments and others that we need to scale that. So innovation partnering is the first role. We secondly have this role called venture builder, where Nesta has an endowment, and we are keen to potentially invest in either existing organizations at an early stage or found new organizations that can make this an opportunity and turn the kind of insights we're generating on the ground into new business models. And then the third role we see for ourselves is what we're calling a system shaper, where all the work we're doing on the ground with partners or supporting new ventures, we want to be able to feed that back to shape policy and regulation so that it is enabling these new business models to occur. And just let me say a bit more on that, because I think one of the problems we have is that everything is so interdependent and connected. So a business model for an energy service company will be highly affected by the tariff structure that Ofgem chooses, or the extent to which they decide that we just need to invest massively in the networks and grid infrastructure rather than demand side response. That will potentially crowd out the incentives for different business models. So unless we evolve regulation with the consumer experience and business models hand in hand, I think we may not get to the right settlement.
Can I go back to something you said that, a little earlier, you were talking about how there was this moment in time in 2006, 2008, where there was this kind of cross-party engagement. Do you feel that now? I mean, obviously the current government talk a lot about their 10-point plan and other things, but do you perceive that there is true kind of re-engagement in that?
I think we're in a very healthy, positive moment at the politically, and it's off the back of, as I said, strong consumer support, strong push around environmental, social governance concerns from business, and both parties seeing green jobs as a bit of an opportunity, and the build-up of things like an offshore wind industry or the recent announcement of batteries for Nissan allow politicians to ally themselves with future jobs, which is why I think this is now politically much more attractive than 10 years ago, when you almost just had the pain of more subsidies and more energy bills as opposed to the gain of new jobs. And you've got enough now to make that attractive. What I worry about is that we are now at the moment where the more difficult asks of consumers are going to have to be made. So we're going to have to start asking consumers to shift how they use their energy and in their homes. And at that point, if it's managed badly, we could have a backlash. And while I think there is a really good, healthy consensus right now, it could be brittle. It doesn't take much. If energy bills rose, or we face another recession, or we somehow ask too much of people too soon, then I think it does risk a big backlash.
There's always this ongoing conversation around decarbonisation of energy, about the kind of equitable nature of that, and are we actually sharing the cost appropriately, right? And I'm sure that must be on your mind in this space as well.
Well, exactly. Now, if you forced every consumer over the next 10 to 15 years to get rid of their fossil fuel use in their home, which I think is what we have to do, you have to be able to support consumers to do that in a cost-effective manner. So one example of that is, at the moment, all the subsidies we put in place in the last decade to build new electricity capacity and insulate homes were all added onto our electricity bill. So billions of pounds are on consumers' electricity bill to pay for those renewable subsidies. And yet at the same time, we're trying to shift people from gas to electricity. And that creates a really difficult incentive. If you are going to push people to do that, it's hard, particularly for those in fuel poverty. And I think revisiting where that subsidy is charged to, and whether it should be charged onto general taxation, for instance, rather than electricity bills, is well worth doing if you're going to maintain public support for this transition.
I mean, you've talked through a number of different elements of this, but for you, what do you see as that kind of most essential, and whether it's essential in the way that Nesta engages, or the things that government must do, or whatever, what is it that is essential next 12 to 18 months versus more medium term?
So I actually think that we need to start getting a long-term policy framework in place for heat. In some ways, if we hadn't had we hadn't botched up the last 10 years on this policy, you could probably buy yourself a bit more time and do things later on. But actually, you need now a signal that we are serious about phasing out gas boilers. So some sort of regulatory signal about a phase out. It can be quite a long-term timescale, and possibly we could ratchet that down over time if we get some momentum. But I think we have to have that clarity in the same way that we have for cars, that we're phasing out boilers. Secondly, I think we have to do something about the price. As I said, if we can lower the price of electricity relative to gas, it could potentially make the heat pumps more cost effective, but also looking at things like the time of use and how far we can incentivize electricity to be used off peak. But the third thing is a really concerted effort to build that early adoption. So to give you one example, there are obviously thousands of people who fit boilers, and we've been talking to them recently, and often they're not the people who are the most healthy advocates of heat pumps. They probably may not actually be qualified to do it themselves. It will cost them hundreds of pounds to actually get qualified. They're not necessarily sure that it's worth their time. They probably don't have heat pumps in their own home. So I think my sort of daft subsidy idea for you for the next 12 months would be to give every person who can fit a gas boiler a heat pump free, because we need a sort of nucleus of advocates, and who better to advocate for this policy than the people who are actually going to come to your home and tell you what to do. And from our own sort of conversations with consumers, that's who they get their advice from in an emergency. And if we've not got that frontline army of people who are advocating this change, we won't get off the ground.
Great. Well, Ravi, thank you so much for joining us. I feel very lucky to have had someone who brings this combination of both energy policy, crisis management, and a fascinating range of experience to bring to bear on this. So thanks again for joining me.
Thank you very much, Alex.